So if you made it this far, you know exactly what character we're dealing with now, Red Robin. So right off the bat, let's start off with a list of materials that were used to make this entire project happen. And there's actually two lists. There's so many things that had to go into the actual process. And you can read those off the screen. I won't have to repeat those for you. Now, if you've got a lot of these in hand, and that's great. If not, you're going to have to acquire some of these things to be able to complete the process on this figure. But once you have those, you're going to end up with something that's really unique, different, and of course, all your own. So right off the bat, let's start off with the custom sculpt that I purchased on eBay. This is a close-up of the sculpt I purchased with this other group of pieces that I needed, and I've got them all from actually two locations. But as you can see, I went ahead and primered the head, and then I just added basic colors, which is just the black cowl and very little of the skin tone with the highlight on the lips, and of course the white eyes. There's not a whole lot to tell on this particular sculpt. It's just that it's going to take you a shorter amount of time to paint because there's less detail. So the first thing to do is prep the entire figure for paint. Obviously, you got to take it apart. That's in another video. You can go back and look at some of the history I have, and you can learn how to take that apart. So I took the Joker's vest, cut the bottom off, and glued it to the top there. And I went ahead and added some epoxy sculpt to fill in the gaps that I didn't want in the design of the boots, and then sanded it down to a nice, smooth, polished finish so that the primer will take properly. And if there's any defects in this, it'll show up in that primer. So it's best to get it as smooth as possible. Same thing for the chest. Remove the emblems, fill in with the epoxy. The one on the back is actually an inlay, and it will leave a very deep gap you have to fill in. Same thing on the front. Actually on the front, it's a molded emblem, so you actually have to grind it down or cut it, and then sand it down as best as possible. Polish it down, fill in the gaps that you don't want, and then sand it down again. Once you've got that done, hit it with your primer, either white or gray, and that's going to be the secret to painting on black. And even though we are painting on black, we're going to have to go back in and use some black ink or paint to create the shading that we want in those areas. And those we want to do now so that when we apply our red paint, it will just take the color or the shadows as if they were naturally enhanced by the light that's hitting it from whatever direction you are wanting to use your lighting from. So here it is already pre-shaded. I just changed the tip on the airbrush and just shaded only the areas that would actually be in shade if it were coming from an angle up above. So switching now to paint, using my Tester's paint, and you can use any paint you want. I use Tester's because that's what I have and I like it. You just gotta learn to work with the properties that it has. Each paint brand has its own properties. Just learn to use it. Use the one you're most happy with, so long as it's acrylic paint. It's going to take a few layers, so make sure your first layer is thin, going up to your second and third. So roughly 3 layers, fourth if you really want to cover a thicker coat on it. In any case, you're still going to have to cover it with your Mr. Super Clear or your preferred method of clear coating, whether it's a shiny, a matte, or a semi-matte. Make sure you apply the same amount of layers of paint or your clear coat once you're finished to each of the individual pieces. Now this is what it looks like when you've got it pre-shaded and you apply the paint. I'm sorry that I had it so low in the angle of the camera there. I just wasn't able to see and paint at the same time. I do have another clip showing that. But in any case, this will give you an idea what the shading now will look like underneath the red paint. And because the paint has a translucency to it, it actually allows for that to happen. If it was an opaque, it would definitely just erase everything. Of course, if you apply several layers of the same paint, you can erase the detail of the shading. But we don't want that. We want the shading to look as natural as possible. It just enhances all of the detail that's in the muscles that are in the abdomen and of course the rest of the torso. Just repeat the same process with the next piece of the body. Apply thin layers of paint, coating over the black areas that are the shading, and this is where you're going to be able to tell if you truly sanded it down properly. If you did not, then this is the time to stop, let the paint dry, and re-sand those areas so that they are nicely polished out before you apply any more paint. Now this is what your figure should look like at this point. And the same thing with the arms, I just don't have a clip on that, but it's the same process. And if you want to dry brush those gauntlets, go ahead. Now as far as the cape, this is something that I already had, so I don't have video on this. But I'm not a cape maker, so I don't have the greatest video on it. But in essence, all it is a half moon or half circle of the fabric, and it's folded in at the edges and it's glued down at the edges. And the two edges on the right and left are then embedded with a very thin wire. It's a 24 gauge wire. That's going to be the best wire for this kind of a posing because it allows flexibility and you can actually bend it back. What I'm going to show you is the custom made bandolier and belt because I do have video on that. And as you can see, the fabric that I'm using there, it's the same fabric as the cape. As a matter of fact, it's from a different cape to a different figure that I didn't like the way it turned out. So I'm going to reuse the fabric on the belt. Now the key to this is cardboard. And the cardboard that you see me gluing down is nothing more than a backer board for a comic book. So I cut it down and the width that I needed, this is just a little bit over a 1/4 inch. And then I just glued it down on one side with the Fabri-tac glue. Now if you haven't worked with this Fabri-tac glue, it's great stuff. It definitely is designed for fabric. Apply it with a different device. In this case I'm using a shaper tool because I can take it off. It's more like a really strong rubber cement. So don't apply it directly onto your material and then start working with it. If you apply it directly on the material, wait for 30 seconds, maybe a minute, for it then to become tacky. If you start working with it while it's still wet, and it's going to be all squishy, and it's just going to go everywhere. But if you wait for it to become tacky, just like the name states, fabric-tac, then it is easier to work with because it doesn't go all over the place, and it dries and adheres very, very quickly. So I've already glued down the board to the material on one side. I'm going to cut a piece of wire, and that's the same wire that's actually on the cape, and I want this wire to be able to give it some shape and hold and retain the shape. The cardboard is generally just for creating a straight edge and some girth to the actual belt. I wanted to use a vinyl, but the vinyl that I have is already cracking, and that's the problem with imitation leather. It deteriorates. That's why all of your Hot Toys are deteriorating, even though they're sitting in a temperature controlled room in a box, in a cardboard box in the mailer. So anyway, getting back to this, cut the wire that you need, the length you need, and then you're going to take your fabric-tac glue again, and you're going to glue this to the outer edge of the board. Wait for a few minutes to go tacky, then fold the edge in over the wire and onto the board, and only work one side at a time. Now I am going to cut this to keep it separate from the rest of the material because I don't want any excess material to work with while I am gluing this down. I don't want any glue for any reason to go on the rest of the material. If it does go on to areas that you don't want, unfortunately, if you don't clean it right away, it will turn white and it's incredibly difficult to remove. You may have to repeat the piece. So make more than one piece just to make sure you have enough material to work with. Now the belt isn't this long, or the bandolier. I'm making it longer so that in case I do have any mistakes, I can cut those off and only use the area that is clean to keep working with. Once you've got it covered, then you cut the angles you need on the ends to make the belt meet, or the bandolier, and apply a piece of material behind it in a backing, and then clamp it either with a paper clip or a clothespin, etc., to keep it tight while it's drying. So here I am applying the fabric-tac glue on one edge only. I'm then going to attach the wire, and try to keep the wire as straight as possible. That way it's not gonna go all over the place while you're bending the material over the edge. So as straight as you can keep it, and then set it along the edge of the board, between the board and the material. That way when you fold it over, it'll stay in place. You may have to use an applicator to direct the wire while you are folding the material on one end. You don't want to have your fingers in the glue, because if you touch the other side of your piece that you're working on, you're just going to transfer fingerprints with glue, and they're going to be impossible to remove. Even if you use a hard eraser, it just ruins the work and you'll have to start over. So, well, once again, be careful, go slowly, make more than one in case you do blow it on the first one. And then once it's tacky, fold the edge over very carefully. Use an applicator to direct the wire back into place. Hold it at one end. Keep folding the edge over until you reach the other end. And then you just repeat the same for the other side. this is what is produced once it's dried. It's got a nice clean edge to it. I've already done this. This is one extra piece that I had from the project earlier. And now that you've got it all dry and ready to go, you take that cardboard and you kink it all the way down from one edge to the other. That'll give it that flexibility. Otherwise, if you just fold it, it kinks and you've got this really hard crease. And then you'll have a really nice moldable belt. Now, if you've got the wire in place, this one here does not have wire. Now this one does. And this is a small chunk of the other. And the wire will actually hold the shape even better. And that's what I used on the Bandolier. It should look like the image that you just saw on the left. And the wire will take shape and hold it wherever you need it, especially when you have to curve it into a V and bring it up into a different area. See how that wire holds? It's so much nicer with the wire, but you still have the cardboard in there. So let's move this aside and move along. This is the time that you want to check for any paint rub, any areas you may have missed in paint, and of course, you just put everything together to see how it all fits. If you did miss a portion, then take it back apart and make sure you seal those. Now the Bandolier and the belt are glued in place. I could have set those different, but it was easier to glue it into the spot where it was going to go, and that way work the rest of it. The same thing with the Bandolier. You have to take the arms off and the chest to slide it up in there and glue it in. And I did put that piece together aside from the body, and then I placed it into the body or onto the body and glued it into place. The best thing about that is that you are able to glue it into the area you need. That way when you move the body, it goes with it. If you leave it loose, then you're consistently gonna have to be adjusting it every time you move or position the body. So it's best to glue it in the area that is gonna move with that body portion. For example, on top, it's glued on top of the chest and on the back of that same torso. The same thing on the belt, it's glued all the way around the bottom. So the trick to this was to make the details for the Bandolier and the belt. And I went through hoops to get this done. I had to figure out how to do it. So I did make some epoxy sculpt into like a little spaghetti, and then I cut it, and it just didn't work. Even though I painted it. Different sizes, different widths, it just didn't work. So I used that same little capsule, that silver one you just saw a minute ago. I'll show it to you in a moment. And I used a reusable mold. And this is like a latex bar that you heat in the water, hot water, for just a few minutes. It becomes malleable. And then you can use your item that you're going to use for a mold, and you make an impression into it. And don't cover the entire thing, just push it in far enough to take a mold of it, because you want to keep one side flush once it's dry. So this is that little chrome piece from another model kit that I had, and I just cut a piece of that spruce and I put it in here because it was a correct width for that capsule. So there it is, grind off the edges, make it round. And now we're gonna mold it in a yellow resin. I used resin once again because it dries quickly, and it works really well with these molds because then it comes out very easily. I don't have to fight it. So once you mix your dye, this is actually a more of a translucent dye, and then your resin, then you pour it into your mold. And I made more than one because I wanted to speed up the process. And even then I still have some rejected pieces because they just didn't turn out as I needed. I wanted a nice clean look for each one. So all you do, you take your applicator, fill in the gap, and once again, if there's any excess on the surface, make sure you clean it off, because you don't want to end up having to clean edges once you pull it out of the mold. You want a nice clean mold. So fill it up as far as you can to the top, but not overfilling it. And do that for each piece. I needed to make at least 20, so I was filling the mold 5 times. So just keep in mind that the thicker the UV resin, the longer the UV light takes for it to cure. So if you do it in thin layers and then finish off the last layer to build up to the top, it will be easier for you to cure it with the UV light. Now once that's done, it's great. It's a really easy process to remove it, and that's why I like these reusable molds. And when I say reusable, you can actually just put it back into that water and then knead it into a little ball or a little brick and reuse it for something else. Now this is what it looks like. It's finally cured. Take that same applicator and that's it. It comes out that easy. Looks like a little capsule. So again, I made 20 of these. Actually, I made 25 because I had a few that didn't turn out. I didn't fill them properly. So each one just the same way. And just be careful when you use that applicator to remove it out of that mold. You don't want to gouge your latex mold and then have to remold it again because you've gouged it. And that's one of the defects that I have right there. So that's one of my rejected pieces. So in any case, do this for all 20. So now comes time to glue the capsules in the buckle to the fabric belt. And that iPhone button has its own glue on the back, but I went ahead and added the Fabri-tac to make it secure. And then with a little pair of tweezers, I attached the little capsules that have Fabri-tac glue on the back. And by having a flat surface on the back of those capsules, it gave me more surface to glue down to on that fabric. There's just one more trick to these little capsules, and it's those little black lines that are on the capsules. Those are not painted. That's actual wire. So I took that same piece that I used for molding, wrapped a wire around it, and then cut that loop into a little horseshoe. And yes, I had to make 24 of those. So then I attached each one of those with a little set of tweezers, and then I glued those down with UV resin. And this is the result. So this concludes this entire project. I hope that you liked it, enjoyed everything that is in here. Please take a look at the screen and see the items that are used in this project. If you don't have them, acquire them so you can produce the same results. I am now going to leave you with a last note on the end of this, which is that water slide decal that you can pick up at online, and you can print it out on your home printer and apply it to the surface you need. In the meantime, enjoy the rest of the video, and of course, like, comment, and subscribe if you haven't done so. But most important, keep customizing those figures.
Mm-hmm.